Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, had a warning for Canadians this week about the state of the economy and what is to come. Even as the country's inflation rate starts to slow a tiny bit, there's still an awful long way to go. But she isn't the only one bracing for more uncertainty and how to respond.
There are still some difficult days ahead for Canada's economy. To say otherwise would be misleading.
I think recession is both likely globally, probable in Canada.
This is homegrown liberal inflation. Why doesn't the Prime Minister stop raising the prices on Canadians so that they can put food on the table?
We know that we need to help people who need help without putting at risk our fiscal stability or contributing further to inflation. We have to prepare for whatever might come.
Some different views there on the state of the economy, including from the former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, who says it will likely feel like a recession globally and certainly in Canada. The International Monetary Fund agrees with that statement. Earlier, I spoke to the fund's chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, about his projections and what it could mean for Canadians. Mr. Gourinchas, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I guess I want to start with what the IMF is saying about the economic forecast for the world, its 2023 outlook. It has been downgraded. You have said that the worst is yet to come. Could you give us a sense of what the worst looks like?
Well, what we are seeing in our latest round of projections is we're forecasting global growth to slow down next year to about 2.7% globally. That's a fairly low number. It's not a global recession, but it's a fairly low number, coming down from 3.2% this year. Now, to give you a sense of why we're saying that the worst is yet to come is under the hood, if you look at this 2.7% growth rate, we're anticipating that about a third of the global economy this year and next are going to experience a contraction, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So growth will slow down. A number of economies will be in recession or in technical contractions. And yet, at the same time, inflation will still be high. It will be coming down, but it will still be high. And this combination, elevated inflation, low growth, is not a combination that feels good.
So our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who I'm sure you know, has certainly warned of difficult days ahead and uses words like slowdown, the government not yet using the word recession. From your projections, would you say that Canada is headed toward a recession, and how would you characterize what we might see?
Well, we have a slowdown that we're projecting in Canada. We're seeing growth coming down to about 1.5% next year. So that's a downward revision. I mean, the Canadian economy has been doing well in the rebound, but it's buffeted by the same winds that are affecting the global economy. There's a slowdown in the U.S. that is coming. Commodity prices, energy prices are coming down. There are all the uncertainties and the financial tightening. Financial markets are very nervous. All of these factors are going to weigh down on the Canadian economy next year.
So it's not going to be a global recession. What countries or what areas will escape this slowdown, as it were?
Well, we are seeing a very broad-based downward revision next year. So all the regions are going to be affected. Now, some countries more than others. And I think, for this year and maybe going into next year, what we're seeing is emerging markets so far have been coping pretty well. But going forward, they are going to be affected as well. And we're concerned that they could experience quite a bit of financial tightness. The strength of the dollar is a problem for many emerging countries. So they've been doing well so far. We're concerned looking ahead.
How much is the geopolitical instability contributing to this? Or is this about, trying to catch up after the pandemic? What would you attribute this to mostly?
Oh, a big part of what we're seeing this year is directly or indirectly related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all of the turmoil we've seen on energy markets, the surge in gas prices in Europe, in oil prices on global markets, food prices. Some of this has been coming down recently, but that's on the back of a slowing down in the global economy. The slowdown in the global economy is bringing down commodity prices. But a lot of the surge we had seen in the first half of the year, and those prices remain elevated, by the way, can be attributed to all the dislocation related to the war in Ukraine.
So you talked about inflation. Obviously, Canada too is struggling with that, although it did tip down just this week. But the food prices remain extremely high, as I'm sure you've seen in other parts of the world too. How does an economic slowdown paired with an inflationary crisis, how does that become more challenging for governments or banks to respond to?
Well, it's a challenge for policymakers in the first place, because if you think about the Bank of Canada, for instance, they have a mandate of price stability, and the way they would do that is by tightening monetary policy, reducing aggregate demand, slowing down the economy to bring down these price pressures. But in the context in which the economy is already slowing down because of the uncertainty and the shocks that are hitting the global economy, it is going to make it that much more painful. Now, it remains the case that central banks around the world, including in Canada, need to bring inflation under control in a timely manner.
What do you think people should be worried about? Regular people who aren't economists like you, what should they be worried about as they head into a slowdown or potentially a recession, I suppose?
Well, I think we're going to see some unemployment increase in coming years, including in Canada. We see that in the U.S. as well. Now, this is starting from a fairly low level. The thing I want to point out here is labor markets are quite tight. They are very strong in many advanced economies, including Canada. Financial conditions is something to watch out for. Of course, it can erupt in many corners of the world. We've seen volatility in the last few weeks in the UK and elsewhere. And so that's something that could happen going forward. There could be more escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, and that would bring back some volatility in energy markets and food markets, food prices. So these are risk factors that we think are quite elevated looking ahead.
Because you pointed to the UK, I am going to ask you, obviously, we've seen the resignation of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom after a very short time period, and after her trying to some way get control of fiscal and economic policy in that country, and it did not work. I think that's fair to say. How concerned are you about economic stability in the United Kingdom right now, and how or if someone can get a hold on it?
Oh, we're absolutely certain that a hold can be had on the economic policy in the UK. I mean, we're not going to comment on the political developments there, but certainly there's been, there are very strong institutions, and we're not worried.
Okay, so you think that it won't take much to come out of this crisis that they seem to be in right now?
Well, I think they've certainly implemented a number of steps to reassure markets, to basically provide some sense of guidance, and we wait to hear more from the UK authorities, but we are not particularly concerned.
Can I just ask one final question? In the 2008 recession, which I realize was far greater than what you're anticipating, and perhaps more complex because there were structural issues there too, the response from governments, particularly in this country, was to spend in terms of a stimulus and pump money into the economy. How much more challenging is it to deal with a slowdown or a recession at the same time as an inflationary crisis?
Well, right now what is really important is central banks have to win the battle against inflation, and they have the tools to do that, and they've started doing this. And that means, as I've mentioned earlier, it means sort of cooling off the economy a little bit to make sure that price pressures come down. So what's very important is budgetary policy, fiscal policy, which has a role to play in protecting households against high energy prices, as certainly some place here. It cannot be doing so in a way that would work at cross-purpose with monetary policy, try to stimulate the economy while central banks are trying to cool it off. That could not work. So our advice here is just make sure that you are providing the relief and the help you need, but in a way that doesn't complicate the task for monetary authorities.
Monsieur Gourinchas, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.